All right, so we've completed priming the concrete. It is now ready for a top coat. We know that by looking and feeling the substrate. When I'm looking at it from an angle, I can see that the product has absorbed mostly evenly. It's never going to completely evenly absorb because the concrete's going to be more porous and less porous in certain areas. I've got some areas here that may be a little bit wet, but it's dry enough to begin the top coat. I'm just going to feel it. It's supposed to feel slightly tacky, so don't worry about if it's feeling a little too tacky. You are supposed to have a tackiness to the substrate, and that is fine for the top coat. So we have completed the priming process here, and the next step is to put our waterborne top coat on the concrete. So we're getting ready to apply our StreetBond 150 now. I just want to go over the application materials with you. For an application like this, which is only going to get pedestrian traffic, we're going to recommend 3 thin coats. If it was getting vehicle traffic, we would want 4 or maybe more. So with this particular application, the first coat's going to go on with a squeegee, and in order to ensure that it adheres well into the substrate, we're going to use a stiff bristle broom to broom the material into the substrate. With that first coat, what you really want is adhesion. You may finish the first coat and it could look blotchy. It could look like it didn't cover. That's okay. Remember, you're putting multiple coats on top of it. So for that first coat, you're not going for a coverage type of look. You're more going for penetration and adhesion into the substrate. And just like any of the StreetBond products that we're going to be talking about throughout these videos, temperature is always going to be something that you need to be aware of. We need to have a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit and rising throughout the entire application process, and really for the first 24 hours of cure time for the product. So we're looking for between 50 and 90 in terms of where your temperature range needs to be. And that of course would go for the surface, the substrate, that would go for the ambient temperature, the temperature around you, and the product temperature. So keep in mind that storing that product in a climate controlled area where it's not gonna get too cold or too hot is very important. Okay, so my partners and I are gonna start to apply the product now. Just a quick word about PPE. This is a waterborne product, so there are no strong solvents or isocyanates in the product that you need to worry about, so a mask is not necessary. However, we still want to wear gloves and we still want to wear eye protection anytime we are applying products. All right, so we've put a little product on the substrate, and now we're just going to spread it with a squeegee, and as soon as we get it spread out, George and Christian are going to begin to broom it. So getting to the edges can be a little bit tricky here sometimes, but as you can see, what George and Christian are doing is they're taking any areas where there may be some thicker product application, and they're just simply with their broom moving those thick spots around so that they can get right up to the edge. This is looking like it's going to be a nice thin coat, which is exactly what we want for the first coat. We want to make sure that there's no real heavy spots. It is a waterborne product, so the solvent, the water, will evaporate out of it. So it'll be a little bit less thick than it is when it goes on wet. We'd want a dry film thickness of about 6 mils. All right, so we've completed our first coat. We definitely were able to get it on thin enough. I have no concerns about coverage at this point. What I'm really looking for is just to make sure that the product is integrated into the substrate. If I do have one criticism about this area, is that when we broomed it, we went in the lengthwise direction, and all the other slabs of concrete, we went in the crosswise direction. So in order to maintain a uniform appearance, you would want to broom in the exact same direction throughout the entire area. Another thing to look out for, and this is one of the reasons why we say that thin coats are super important, is even drying time. The thicker the coating is, the longer it's going to take to dry. And if we want to have a recoat period where the whole substrate is ready to be recoat, we want to make sure we put that even thin coat on it. We're about 95% good here. There are a couple of areas though where the product went on a little bit more thick than it needed to. So even though it is dry on the outside, you can see that it is still wet on the inside. So if I were to go over top of that with a squeegee or a roller, there's a potential that I could make a mess. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of scrape this off this particular area and give the bottom layer an opportunity to dry. Remember, we're going to put a few more coats on here. So if you do have thick spots and you want to address them with a little 4-in-1 or whatever you have, feel free to do that. That's not going to impact the final appearance. So we're starting our second coat now. We just dumped a little bit of product on this slab, and for coat number 2, coat number 3, and 4, we squeegee, and then instead of the brooming, we're going to use a 3/8 nap roller, and we're just going to lightly back roll the material so that it has a even appearance. Again, thin coat, thin coat. You don't want any thick spots. And we're not putting a lot of pressure on the roller. We're just very, very lightly running it across just to get a little bit of lift on the material. So we just finished our third coat. This area is a pretty small area, so it was simple for us to be able to apply the product with a wet edge. However, if you're working with a larger area, say I was doing this parking lot that I'm standing in right now, then it would be a lot more critical for you to plan out your application so that you can always maintain a wet edge, because what's going to happen is if you run out of material and then go catalyze another bucket, by the time you get back to paint that area, there's going to be a dry line and it will be visible in the finished product. So you always want to maintain a wet on wet application. How do you do that when you're doing such a large area? First thing you need to do is understand the coverage. So one bucket of StreetBond 150 will give you roughly 600 square feet per coat. So I would take this area and I would break it off into 600 square foot sections, and I would make sure as I was getting close to the end of one of those sections that I would have someone catalyzing another kit so it was ready for me as soon as I'm ready for it. That way I know I'm rolling wet into wet and we won't have any lap marks or imperfections in the finished product.